Are the member countries of free trade agreements better off? With much recent discussion and debates surrounding the current devising of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, it would seem rather appropriate to pay heed to the momentous 20-year anniversary of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. After all, what better way to look into the future than to look at the lessons provided to us by past free trade agreements? As Mark Twain once noted, history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So what is NAFTA? NAFTA is a trilateral free trade deal that came into force in January 1994, signed by President Bill Clinton, Mexican President Carlos Salinas, and Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. The central thrust of the agreement is to eliminate most tariffs on products traded among the United States, Mexico, and Canada. The terms of the agreement called for these tariffs to be phased out gradually, and the final aspects of the deal weren't fully implemented until January 1st, 2008. The deal swept away import tariffs in several industries. Agriculture was a major focus, but tariffs were also reduced on items like textiles and automobiles. NAFTA also implemented intellectual property protections, established dispute resolution mechanisms, and set up regional labor and environmental safeguards, though some critics now lobby for stronger measures on this front. At its inception, NAFTA was credited with becoming the world's largest free trade zone. Accordingly, this trade zone currently produces $17 trillion worth of goods and services, of which 9.4% of that total is traded between the US and its partners. As Heckscher Olin's trade theory would posit, the US had a goods trade deficit of $41 billion and $95 billion in 2009 and 2010 respectively, whereas it has surpluses in services. Less esoterically, the US will export greater quantities of the product that intensively uses its most abundant factor.
I think NAFTA has overall been quite good in terms of integrating the North American economy. Clearly, with any sort of trade agreement, there's and any sort of expansion of trade, there's going to be winners and losers. But it does seem that with NAFTA, there's been more winners than losers, and overall the effect's been quite positive. The new TPP agreement is focusing not so much on a reduction of tariffs, but in trying to harmonize regulations across many countries. And it sort of highlights some of the challenges about sort of trying to harmonize regulations across countries that are very at very different stages of, they're not completely different stages of development, but who are at different stages of development, and they have very different preferences about what kind of regulations they would like to have in terms of environmental regulations or business regulations. I mean, it's a sort of the work that our former colleague Chad Fang emphasized, is that many barriers to trade now are non-tariff barriers. They're regulatory barriers, and trying to remove some of those barriers would be quite helpful. Having said that, some of those regulations are there for a reason, in terms of that some countries have preferences in terms of the rights of workers, how the regulations about surrounding labor, and the regulations surrounding the environment. The question will be whether will bring regulations up to the standards of, say, the United States, or whether it'll be sort of a race to the bottom in which some countries that have strict environmental regulations will have to undo some of those. The devil's in the details. We'll see what comes out of this process.
What's NAFTA? The North American Free Trade Agreement. It's a highly protectionist agreement instituted by the United States and associated elites in Mexico and Canada, directed against the populations of their own countries, all three, and also against Europe and Japan. That's just a protectionist weapon against Europe and Japan. So there are lots of complicated things happening all at once, but the major tendency right now is towards transfer of power to private tyrannies and away from the public sphere. And that's very dangerous. It's happening in particular countries at different rates. It's happening internationally. And I think that's going to be very harmful to values that we ought to share, like democracy.
If we examine Mexico's gross domestic product composition, the country experienced a notable inflection point in exports between 1994 and 1995. Mexico's exports as a percentage of GDP increased from 13% to 25%, an actual increase of 23% in exports according to World Bank data. As of 2010, NAFTA has continued to remain the foundation and greatest source of imports for the United States. Imports from Canada totaled to $276.5 billion, whereas Mexico's imports to the United States were to the amount of $229.7 billion. As a percentage of total import flows, trade with Mexico and Canada accounted for 9% and 10%, respectively. Some estimates place this percentage higher at approximately 26%. Exports reveal a similar story, as NAFTA export flows from the United States were roughly 22% of total exports. One can thus argue that NAFTA has provided a mutually beneficial economic value. Debate over this issue continues to largely revolve around how policymakers and theoreticians define the agreement's success metrics. In other words, the debate over the North American Free Trade Agreement has continued to remain at a philosophical standstill.